So, you want to build a gigafactory. Take an enormous plot of empty desert or farmland, build a single building large enough to be visible from space, and inside it, manufacture everything from raw battery cells to finished electric vehicles rolling off the line under one roof at a scale nobody in the auto industry had really attempted before. It sounds like a genuinely bold, almost brute force approach to manufacturing. Instead of assembling a car from parts made by hundreds of outside suppliers scattered across the globe, you build as much of it as possible yourself, in one place, and bet that doing it that way is actually cheaper in the long run. Here's the problem. A factory this size doesn't just cost a lot of money to build. It costs a genuinely staggering amount of money before it produces a single sellable product. And unlike a smaller, more conventional factory, you can't really build it in stages and start generating revenue along the way in any meaningful sense, because the entire economic case for building something this large in the first place depends on hitting a production volume that only becomes possible once most of the facility is actually up and running. You're betting billions of dollars on a building years before you know for certain that building will ever actually work the way you designed it to. Let's start with what it actually costs to get one of these facilities built in the first place, because the sticker price alone is enough to make most companies never seriously consider this approach at all. A single gigafactory scale facility can cost several $billion to construct, and that number is before you've installed a single piece of manufacturing equipment inside it. The raw building itself, at the scale involved, some of these facilities cover footprints measured in the tens of millions of square feet. Once you include all the surrounding structures, is itself one of the largest industrial construction projects most contractors will ever work on in their careers. Then you have to fill that building with equipment, and this is where the number climbs even further. Battery cell production lines, the robotics and stamping equipment needed for vehicle body assembly, the paint shop, which is its own enormous and expensive undertaking in any automotive factory, and increasingly, the equipment needed to actually process raw battery materials on site rather than simply receiving finished cells from an outside supplier. Add it all up, and a single fully built-out gigafactory can represent a total capital investment well into the billions of dollars, sometimes approaching or exceeding what it costs to build several conventional automotive assembly plants combined. Now, here's where the actual strategic logic behind this approach gets genuinely interesting, because it's not simply about building a bigger factory for the sake of scale. The core idea is vertical integration, controlling as many steps of the manufacturing process as possible under one company, rather than depending on an outside supplier for each individual component. A traditional automaker generally buys its battery cells from a specialized battery manufacturer, buys many of its major components from a sprawling network of outside suppliers, and focuses its own factories primarily on final assembly. This approach flips that model, bringing battery cell production, and in some cases, raw material processing, inside the same company, sometimes inside the very same building where the finished vehicle eventually rolls off the line. This is a genuinely enormous bet, because vertical integration cuts both ways financially. On one hand, if you can actually manufacture battery cells more efficiently than an outside supplier would charge you for them, you capture that margin yourself instead of paying it to someone else, and you gain direct control over your own supply chain rather than being at the mercy of another company's production schedule and pricing decisions. On the other hand, you've now taken on the entire risk and cost of battery cell manufacturing yourself, an extraordinarily difficult and capital-intensive business in its own right, layered directly on top of the already difficult and capital-intensive business of manufacturing cars. If your in-house battery production runs into problems, you don't have a backup supplier to lean on the way a traditional automaker would. You've made the success of your car business directly dependent on your success at an entirely separate, extraordinarily hard manufacturing challenge. Let's talk about battery cell manufacturing specifically, because this is genuinely one of the hardest manufacturing processes in the entire supply chain, and it's a big part of why owning it yourself is such a significant undertaking. Battery cells require an extraordinarily clean, precisely controlled manufacturing environment, because even microscopic contamination or a tiny manufacturing defect can create a cell that's not just underperforming, but genuinely dangerous, at risk of overheating or, in rare but real cases, catching fire. This means the manufacturing equipment and the facility environment itself have to meet standards closer to what you'd expect in a semiconductor fabrication plant than a traditional car factory, with tightly controlled humidity, temperature, and airborne particle levels throughout the production process. The raw materials themselves add another layer of cost and complexity that has nothing to do with the factory building at all. Battery cells require lithium, nickel, cobalt, and other minerals sourced from a genuinely concentrated set of mining regions globally, and companies building out battery cell manufacturing at this scale have increasingly had to sign long-term supply agreements directly with mining and refining companies, sometimes taking equity stakes in mining operations themselves, specifically to guarantee access to enough raw material at a predictable price. Losing access to even one of these critical minerals at the volume needed would be genuinely catastrophic for a company that's committed this much manufacturing capacity to battery production specifically. Now, let's talk about labor and the physical scale of actually running one of these facilities day to day, because a gigafactory isn't just a large building, it's essentially a small city's worth of coordinated activity happening simultaneously. These facilities can employ tens of thousands of workers across multiple shifts running around the clock and coordinating that many people, doing genuinely different kinds of work, from delicate battery cell assembly to heavy stamping press operation to final vehicle assembly, all under one roof, is a logistics challenge that goes well beyond what a traditional single-purpose factory ever has to manage. Here's a detail that catches people off guard about this approach. Because so much of the manufacturing process happens under one roof, a problem in one part of the facility can ripple through the entire operation in a way that wouldn't happen if you were sourcing components from dozens of independent outside suppliers. If the battery cell production line inside the facility runs into a quality problem or has to slow down for any reason, it doesn't just affect battery output. It can directly bottleneck the vehicle assembly line sitting right next to it, because there's no outside battery supplier to fall back on while the internal problem gets fixed. This is a genuinely different kind of operational risk than a traditional automaker faces, where a problem at one outside supplier is serious but is at least somewhat contained to that specific component, rather than potentially cascading through the company's own single, massive facility. Let's talk about how this facility actually generates a return on that enormous initial investment, because the economics only really work at genuinely massive production volume. The entire logic behind building a facility this large is that manufacturing cost per unit drops significantly as production volume increases, spreading the enormous fixed cost of the building and equipment across millions of battery cells and thousands of vehicles, rather than a much smaller number. This means a gigafactory that's running well below its designed capacity is in a genuinely difficult financial position because it's still carrying essentially the same enormous fixed costs. The building, the equipment, the base level of staffing required just to keep the facility operational while generating meaningfully less revenue to spread those costs across. This creates a genuinely important tension for how these facilities get built and ramped up in the real world. You generally can't wait until you have guaranteed demand for the full production volume before building the facility, because it takes years to construct and equip, but you also can't build it and then simply flip a switch to full production on day one, because ramping up a manufacturing process this complex to its designed capacity is itself a genuinely difficult engineering challenge that typically takes many months or even years longer than initial projections suggest, a pattern that's shown up repeatedly across new manufacturing facilities at this scale in this industry specifically. There's a real case study worth walking through here because it illustrates exactly how difficult and expensive that ramp-up period can genuinely be. Several of these large-scale battery and vehicle manufacturing facilities have experienced what the industry has come to call, somewhat grimly, production hell. Extended periods where the facility is burning through enormous amounts of cash on labor, equipment, and materials while producing well below its designed output because the manufacturing process hasn't yet been refined enough to run reliably at full speed. During these periods, a company can be spending at a rate that would bankrupt a smaller business in a matter of months, betting that the production bottlenecks are solvable engineering problems rather than fundamental flaws in the underlying approach. When that bet pays off, the eventual payoff can be enormous because the facility eventually reaches a scale of output that genuinely does bring costs down the way the original plan promised. When it doesn't resolve quickly enough, the cash burn during that extended ramp-up period can threaten the financial stability of the entire company, not just the specific facility struggling to reach capacity. Let's talk about what can go wrong in this business more broadly, beyond the ramp-up risk specifically, because a facility this large and this specialized carries a genuinely unusual set of vulnerabilities. Because so much capital and manufacturing capability is concentrated in a small number of enormous facilities rather than spread across many smaller, more flexible plants. A serious disruption at any single gigafactory, a natural disaster, a major equipment failure, a regional power grid problem, a labor dispute, represents a much larger percentage of total company production capacity than a similar disruption would at a traditional automaker running a larger number of smaller, more geographically distributed factories. This concentration risk is the direct flip side of the efficiency benefits that come from building everything under one roof in the first place. Currency and geopolitical risk matter enormously too, because these facilities are increasingly being built in multiple countries specifically to serve different regional markets and to reduce the risk of tariffs or trade restrictions affecting vehicles built in one country and sold in another. But that international expansion strategy means replicating this entire enormously complex, enormously expensive manufacturing approach in a new country with a different regulatory environment, a different labor market, a different local supply chain for raw materials, and a different set of construction and permitting timelines, which means every new gigafactory built in a new country essentially restarts a meaningful share of the same ramp-up risk and cost that the very first facility had to work through originally. So how does this business actually work in plain mechanical terms once you strip away all the complexity? Revenue from vehicle sales plus revenue from any battery cells or energy storage products sold outside the company's own vehicles, minus the enormous fixed cost of building and maintaining the facility itself, minus raw material costs for battery minerals sourced globally, minus labor costs for a workforce numbering in the tens of thousands, minus the ongoing capital investment required to keep expanding capacity or adding new production lines as demand grows. For a facility running at full design capacity, the manufacturing cost advantage from vertical integration and scale can be genuinely significant. But for a facility still working through its ramp-up period or running meaningfully below capacity due to soft demand, the same enormous fixed cost structure that creates the advantage at full scale becomes a genuine financial burden instead. Here's the volatility layered on top of that math. Battery mineral prices can swing significantly based on global commodity markets outside the company's control, directly affecting the cost advantage that vertical integration is supposed to provide in the first place. Vehicle demand itself is tied to the broader economy and to consumer willingness to make a genuinely large discretionary purchase, which means an economic downturn can simultaneously reduce vehicle sales and leave an enormous, expensive facility running below the volume it needs to hit for its cost advantages to actually materialize. And a manufacturing or quality problem discovered after a facility has already ramped up to significant volume can require an expensive, large-scale response, specifically because so many units were produced at that same facility using the same process before the problem was caught. Let's put together the two versions of a single year for a facility like this. In a strong year, the ramp-up curve has matured past its most difficult early phase. Production runs at or near designed capacity. Battery mineral costs stay stable or decline due to favorable global supply conditions, and vehicle demand is strong enough to actually sell everything the facility is capable of producing. Under those conditions, the facility can generate genuinely excellent margins because the enormous fixed cost of the building and equipment is now being spread across a large enough volume that the vertical integration strategy pays off exactly the way it was designed to. In a difficult year, a battery production line runs into an unexpected quality issue that slows output company-wide because there's no outside supplier to fall back on. Battery mineral prices spike due to a supply disruption in a key mining region. Vehicle demand softens due to broader economic conditions, leaving the facility running meaningfully below its designed capacity. And a new international facility in a different country hits its own ramp-up delays, requiring additional capital investment before it can contribute meaningfully to overall production. Under those conditions, the company can be burning through cash at the facility level, even while the building itself still looks from the outside exactly as impressive and futuristic as it did during the strong year. The same enormous structure, the same visible scale, the same story about the future of manufacturing, none of which shows up as a physical difference from the road. The difference between those 2 years can run into billions of dollars, and almost none of it shows up as one dramatic headline. It's a battery line running slower than projected here, a mineral price spike compounding costs there, a new facility's ramp-up taking longer than the investor presentation originally promised, compounding quietly against a backdrop of a factory that from the outside looks exactly the same either way. The building is still enormous. The production line is still visibly moving. The vehicles are still rolling off the end of the line and out toward dealers and customers, because nothing about the physical scene changes based on which version of the year is actually unfolding on the company's balance sheet that quarter. There's another layer to this that rarely makes it into the glossy factory tour videos, and that's the role governments play in actually getting one of these facilities built in the first place. Because a gigafactory brings thousands of jobs, years of guaranteed construction work, and a massive new addition to the local tax base, regions competing to host one of these facilities routinely offer enormous incentive packages to win the bid. This can include direct tax abatements that waive property taxes for a decade or more, cash grants tied to job creation targets, discounted or even free land, and utility agreements that lock in favorable electricity rates for years into the future. In some of the largest deals, the value of these incentive packages has run into the billions of dollars, effectively meaning the public sector is subsidizing a meaningful share of the total construction cost in exchange for the long-term economic activity the facility is expected to generate. This creates an interesting dynamic because it means the true cost of building a gigafactory, from the company's perspective, can look very different depending on which government is bidding hardest to host it. A facility that would be financially borderline in one location can become significantly more attractive once you factor in a decade of reduced tax burden and cheaper power. It also means these companies have real leverage in negotiations because multiple states or countries are often competing against each other for the same investment, each trying to outbid the others with a larger incentive package. Critics of this practice argue it amounts to a subsidy race that mostly benefits large, already well-capitalized companies, while supporters argue the long-term tax revenue and job creation more than make up for the upfront concessions once the facility is fully operational. Energy and water consumption are worth dwelling on a bit longer too, because a facility at this scale doesn't just need a lot of electricity to run its equipment. It needs an extraordinarily reliable and consistent supply of it. Battery cell manufacturing in particular is an energy-intensive process, and any unplanned interruption to power, even a brief one, can potentially ruin an entire batch of cells mid-production, turning a short outage into a genuinely expensive loss of materials and output. This is why these facilities are almost always built with direct dedicated connections to major transmission infrastructure, and increasingly with on-site backup power generation or battery storage of their own, specifically so a regional grid problem doesn't bring the entire operation to a halt. Water usage matters for similar reasons, particularly in facilities located in drier climates where land and power might otherwise be cheap and abundant. Certain steps of the battery manufacturing process require significant volumes of water, both for cooling equipment and for specific chemical processes involved in producing battery-grade materials. In regions already dealing with water scarcity, this has occasionally become a genuine point of local tension, with communities and regulators pushing back on approving new industrial-scale water usage, which adds yet another variable that has to be solved for during the already lengthy site selection and permitting process, well before construction on the actual building even begins. Workforce development is another cost that's easy to overlook when you're just looking at the price tag of the building and the equipment inside it. Because this kind of manufacturing at this scale simply didn't exist in a given region before, there often isn't a large pool of workers nearby who already know how to run a battery cell production line or operate the specialized robotics used in vehicle assembly at this volume. Companies building these facilities frequently have to invest heavily in training programs, sometimes partnering directly with local community colleges or trade schools to build an entirely new pipeline of skilled workers essentially from scratch. This training investment doesn't show up as a dramatic line item the way the cost of the building does, but across a workforce numbering in the tens of thousands, it represents a genuinely significant and ongoing cost, particularly in the early years when turnover tends to be highest and the workforce is still climbing its own learning curve alongside the production line itself. There's also a secondary revenue opportunity that's become increasingly important as these facilities have matured, and that's everything that happens to a battery after it leaves the factory. Companies that manufacture their own battery cells at this scale have started building out businesses around large-scale stationary energy storage, selling battery systems to utility companies and large commercial customers for purposes that have nothing to do with vehicles at all, from smoothing out fluctuations on the power grid to storing solar energy generated during the day for use after the sun goes down. This gives a gigafactory a second customer base beyond car buyers, which can be a genuinely useful buffer during periods when vehicle demand softens, since the same battery production lines can often be reallocated, at least partially, toward these stationary storage products instead. Recycling has become part of this picture too, and it's likely to matter more with each passing year. As the first large generation of electric vehicle batteries built at this scale starts reaching the end of its usable life, companies that control their own battery manufacturing are in a uniquely strong position to also control the recycling process, recovering valuable minerals like lithium, nickel, and cobalt from old battery packs and feeding them back into new cell production. Done well, this can meaningfully reduce dependence on newly mined raw materials over time, insulating the business somewhat from the exact kind of mineral price volatility discussed earlier. It's still an emerging part of the business for most companies operating at this scale, but it's increasingly viewed as a long-term strategic asset rather than simply an environmental afterthought, precisely because it ties back into the same vertical integration logic that justified building the facility this way in the first place. Finally, it's worth stepping back and asking whether this entire approach is actually the future of manufacturing or a genuinely unusual bet that happened to work for a specific set of companies at a specific moment in the industry's development. A growing number of traditional automakers have started building their own large-scale battery facilities, often in partnership with established battery manufacturers, rather than going fully vertically integrated on their own, which suggests the broader industry sees real value in bringing at least some battery production in-house, without necessarily taking on the full risk of building an entire Gigafactory-style facility from scratch. Whether the extreme version of this approach, one enormous building doing almost everything under one roof, becomes the standard model across the industry, or remains a distinctive strategy associated with a handful of companies willing to take on this level of concentrated risk, is still very much an open question that the next decade of the industry is going to answer.
There's one more thing worth considering before wrapping this up, and it's the question of what happens to a facility like this once it eventually needs to be upgraded or replaced. Manufacturing equipment inside these buildings, particularly battery production lines, doesn't stay cutting edge forever. Battery chemistry itself keeps evolving, with newer formulations promising better range, faster charging, or lower material costs. And a production line built around one generation of battery chemistry isn't always easy or cheap to retrofit for the next one. This means a company operating a gigafactory has to keep making an ongoing judgment call about when to invest in upgrading existing lines versus building entirely new capacity elsewhere. A decision that carries real financial weight given how much was already sunk into the original build. This is part of why some analysts view the gigafactory model as a genuinely double-edged strategic bet. The same scale that creates such a powerful cost advantage once everything is running smoothly also creates a kind of inertia. A facility this large and this specialized is hard to pivot quickly if the underlying technology or market shifts faster than expected. A smaller, more traditional factory relying on outside suppliers can often adapt to a new battery chemistry simply by switching suppliers. A company that's built its own dedicated production line around one specific chemistry has a much harder, more expensive decision to make if a competitor's approach turns out to be meaningfully better.
So if you ever find yourself dreaming about building something like a gigafactory, remember the one thing that actually determines whether a bet this size pays off. It was never really about how big or how impressive the building looks from the outside. It's about whether you can actually get that enormous, complicated machine running at the volume the entire financial bet depended on before the cash you're burning to get there runs out.